Most people see the Volkswagen Beetle as a symbol of simplicity, a small, rounded car built for everyday life. What almost no one considers is where it came from. The Beetle was not designed in a time of peace. It was engineered before a global war, repurposed during that war, and nearly destroyed by it. Before it became one of the most recognizable cars in history, the Beetle existed inside factories targeted by bombers and decisions shaped by survival. This documentary begins before the car ever reached the road. In January 1934, Germany was still recovering from economic collapse, social unrest, and national humiliation left behind by the First World War. Automobiles were rare, expensive, and firmly out of reach for the average family. Fewer than 1 German in 50 owned a car. Roads existed, but they were mostly empty. Mobility was a privilege, not a right. It was in this environment that the idea of a people's car began to circulate, not as a commercial dream, but as a political and industrial objective. That same year, engineer Ferdinand Porsche submitted a proposal to the German Transport Ministry outlining a small, affordable, fuel-efficient automobile that could carry a family of 4 at highway speeds. The design was technical, but the goal was simple: mass motorization. The concept aligned perfectly with the government's broader agenda to modernize infrastructure and unify the population around shared national projects. The car was not yet called Volkswagen, but the idea was already taking shape. By May 1938, construction began on an enormous factory complex near the village of Fallersleben. A new town was planned around it, later named Wolfsburg. The scale was unprecedented. This was not just a factory, it was a statement. When the cornerstone was laid, speeches focused on prosperity, unity, and the future of civilian life. The car itself, later known as the Beetle, was presented as a symbol of stability and progress. But even as the factory walls rose, the geopolitical climate was deteriorating rapidly. Europe was sliding toward conflict. Resources began shifting quietly. Production timelines slipped. Materials originally intended for civilian vehicles were reallocated. The factory that had been designed to produce family cars had not yet built one for the public, and soon it never would. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II officially began, not a single privately owned Volkswagen had been delivered to the citizens who had paid into the program. The factory stood ready, but its purpose was about to change completely. The people's car was no longer a civilian priority. Survival, logistics, and war had taken over. Volkswagen had been born, but not into peace. It entered history standing at the edge of a global conflict that would redefine everything it was meant to be.
When war began in September 1939, the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg did not shut down. It transformed. Almost overnight, the original mission of building an affordable civilian car was suspended. The assembly lines that had been planned for families were repurposed for military logistics. This was not a gradual shift. It was immediate and absolute. Civilian production was no longer relevant. What mattered was speed, durability, and volume. The Beetle design, originally engineered for simplicity and efficiency, proved adaptable to military needs. Engineers modified the chassis, raised the suspension, simplified body panels, and stripped away anything unnecessary. The result was the Kubowagen, a lightweight utility vehicle designed for rough terrain. It was not armored, it was not luxurious, but it was reliable, easy to repair, and capable of operating where heavier vehicles failed. That reliability would become a defining trait of Volkswagen's engineering identity. By 1940, Wolfsburg was producing vehicles almost exclusively for the military. Kübelwagens were deployed across Europe, from paved roads to muddy supply routes. Amphibious variants followed, including the Schwimmwagen, which could cross rivers and marshlands using a rear-mounted propeller. These vehicles were never intended for civilian eyes. They were tools of movement, designed to function under constant stress. Inside the factory, conditions hardened. Production quotas increased. Materials became harder to source. Skilled labor was gradually replaced or supplemented as manpower shortages grew. The factory expanded its footprint, but efficiency came at a human cost. Wartime industrial pressure reshaped every process. The focus was no longer innovation for consumers, but output for survival. The promise made to hundreds of thousands of German citizens that their savings would one day become a car quietly disappeared. The savings program continued on paper for a time, but delivery was no longer discussed. The factory had moved on, and so had the state. Volkswagen, still a young company, had become fully embedded in the wartime economy. By 1942, the Wolfsburg plant was no longer a symbol of civilian progress. It was a functioning component of a nation at war. Production was steady, but the factory was now a strategic target. Allied reconnaissance flights mapped the complex. Bombing raids became a looming certainty. What had been built to represent the future of everyday life was now exposed to the realities of total war. Volkswagen was no longer becoming a car company. It was becoming a wartime manufacturer, shaped by urgency, pressure, and compromise. By late 1942, the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg had become fully visible to Allied intelligence. Its size, output, and location marked it as a legitimate military-industrial target. Air raids began sporadically at first, then with increasing frequency. Bombs did not distinguish between assembly halls, storage depots, or worker housing. Sections of the plant were damaged, repaired, then damaged again. Production slowed, but it did not stop. As the war intensified, labor shortages deepened. Skilled workers were pulled into military service, and the factory increasingly relied on foreign laborers and prisoners brought in under coercive conditions. Living quarters were overcrowded and tightly controlled. Food was rationed. Movement was restricted. The pressure to meet production demands remained constant, even as resources diminished and morale collapsed. Volkswagen, like many industrial sites of the era, continued operating under circumstances that reflected the broader breakdown of wartime Europe. Material shortages forced engineers to improvise. Steel quality declined. Components were simplified further. Vehicles left the factory with fewer refinements and increasing inconsistencies. The emphasis was no longer on longevity, but on immediate utility. Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens were shipped directly to active fronts, often with minimal testing. Some never returned, others broke down and were abandoned. The factory kept producing because stopping was not an option. By 1944, Allied bombing had caused severe structural damage. Entire sections of the Wolfsburg plant lay in ruins. Power outages were common. Transportation links were disrupted. Air raid sirens became routine. Workers learned to pause production, take cover, and resume when possible. The idea of Volkswagen as a future civilian car maker had all but vanished.
Survival was the only remaining objective. In early 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, the factory's situation became untenable. Supply lines collapsed, command structures fractured, orders became inconsistent or stopped entirely. When American troops reached the area, they found a heavily damaged industrial complex surrounded by unfinished vehicles, scattered parts, and a workforce on the edge of exhaustion. The war ended in May 1945. Volkswagen had produced thousands of military vehicles, but had never delivered on its original promise to the public. The factory stood damaged, directionless, and politically tainted by its wartime role. Many assumed it would be dismantled or shut down permanently. The idea that this ruined plant could ever produce cars for ordinary people again seemed unrealistic. Volkswagen had survived the war physically, but not as a company with a future. That future would now depend on decisions made by outsiders, not its original creators.
After the war ended in May 1945, the Volkswagen factory fell inside the British occupation zone. What the British Army found at Wolfsburg was not a functioning company, but a wrecked industrial site. Roofs were blown out, machinery was damaged or missing. Power was unreliable. The surrounding town was struggling with food shortages and displaced populations. On paper, Volkswagen had no future. The factory existed, but the company effectively did not. Initial assessments considered dismantling the plant entirely. This was standard practice for large industrial facilities associated with the German war economy. Equipment could be shipped abroad as reparations. The buildings could be leveled. Several Allied governments were consulted about taking over the factory. None were interested. British manufacturers declined, calling the car poorly designed and commercially unviable. American companies passed without serious review. Volkswagen was seen as obsolete before it had ever entered the market. The turning point came through a practical decision rather than a visionary one. British Army Major Ivan Hurst was tasked with managing the site. His objective was simple: stabilize the area and provide vehicles for occupation forces. Hurst saw potential not in the brand, but in the machinery that remained. He ordered the factory cleaned, repaired where possible, and restarted at minimal capacity. The goal was not profit, it was utility. Using salvaged parts and damaged tooling, the factory began producing a small number of civilian-style Beetles. These early post-war cars were crude, inconsistent, and often unreliable, but they ran, and in a country with almost no civilian transportation, that mattered. British authorities placed an order for 20,000 vehicles to support administrative operations. This single decision kept the factory alive. As production slowly resumed, German workers returned. Conditions were still harsh. Food shortages persisted. Housing was limited. But the factory now had direction. Engineers refined processes. Quality improved incrementally. The Beetle's simple design proved ideal for post-war constraints. It used little fuel, required minimal materials, and could be repaired easily. What had once been a wartime compromise became a post-war advantage. By 1948, Volkswagen was transferred back to German control under a new management structure. Heinrich Nordhoff, a former Opel executive, was appointed to lead the company. He approached the role with discipline and realism. Nordhoff focused on quality, export potential, and consistency. He did not chase innovation, he stabilized what already worked. By 1949, Volkswagen was no longer a ruined factory under military supervision. It was a functioning car manufacturer producing tens of thousands of vehicles annually. The Beetle, once a political concept and later a military tool, had become a civilian necessity. Against expectations, Volkswagen had survived not because of its origins, but because of its adaptability. The company had passed through war, destruction, and near erasure. Now, for the first time, it had a real chance to become what it was always supposed to be.
By the early 1950s, Volkswagen was no longer operating in crisis mode. Production stabilized, quality improved, and exports began expanding beyond Germany's borders. The Beetle, once an unrealized promise and later a wartime utility, entered the international market at exactly the right moment. Much of Europe was rebuilding, fuel was expensive, roads were damaged, consumers needed cars that were affordable, durable, and easy to maintain. Volkswagen offered all three. Under Heinrich Nordhoff's leadership, the company avoided radical redesigns. Instead, it focused on refinement. Small mechanical improvements were introduced gradually, ensuring reliability rather than novelty. This approach built trust. Buyers knew what they were getting. Mechanics understood how to repair the car. Parts were standardized. The Beetle became predictable in the best possible way. Exports to the United States began cautiously, then accelerated. In post-war America, the Beetle stood out. It was smaller, slower, and visually different from domestic cars, but that difference became its strength. It appealed to buyers who valued practicality over excess. Over time, the Beetle gained a reputation for durability and honesty. Volkswagen's marketing reinforced this image, leaning into simplicity rather than competing on luxury or power. By the 1960s, Volkswagen had transformed from a recovered factory into a global manufacturer. The Wolfsburg plant expanded, new facilities were built, millions of Beetles rolled off assembly lines and onto roads across Europe, North America, and beyond. What made this rise remarkable was not innovation alone, but consistency. Volkswagen did not erase its past, it outgrew it. The company's World War II origins remained a complex and uncomfortable part of its history, but its post-war success was built on accountability, structural reform, and a clear separation from its original political purpose. Volkswagen became a civilian company in the truest sense, producing vehicles for everyday life, not ideology or conflict. Decades later, the Beetle would be retired, revived, and ultimately discontinued, yet its impact remained permanent. Volkswagen proved that a company born in instability could redefine itself through discipline, restraint, and long-term thinking. It did not succeed quickly. It survived first, then succeeded. Volkswagen's story is not one of clean beginnings. It is the story of transformation. A company conceived under pressure, reshaped by war, nearly erased by defeat, and rebuilt into one of the most influential automotive brands in the world. That legacy remains embedded in every vehicle that carries the name.